Okay, let me begin by adding my good morning and telling you that I'm Elliot Stein, and I will be co-moderating this session with my colleague Dave Knoll, who's sitting to my far right, your far left. I'm the executive director of ULI's San Francisco District Council, and I've had the pleasure of living and working in the San Francisco Bay Area for some 30 years as a real estate economist, and I've been a longtime observer of the evolution of Silicon Valley and what I'll call the recent resurgence of San Francisco as an amazing model for innovation and creativity. In this session, we're going to be talking about San Francisco and Austin, Texas as two examples, two case studies. But I also want to emphasize that more important than those two examples, we're really here to talk about lessons learned from our respective experiences in those two cities, trying to identify both things that might be unique to Austin and to San Francisco that have enabled some of the successes to occur, but also, and even more importantly, to talk about the things that we think are applicable to other areas. I'll introduce the four panelists in just a moment, but first I'd like to just briefly set the stage for this discussion. And I also think, and I congratulate the people who put together this program and really the sequencing, because I think our panel is a great transition from the one we just heard, where there was a lot of discussion specifically about buildings, about examples, what Pixar has done and why they did it and how it's worked. One of the final questions had to do with how do you transfer that to what's happening or can happen in neighborhoods and in cities. And we have a panel here ideally suited to address that very question. We'll be talking about things on that scale. Just to remind you, the overview statement, here we are, say 3/4 of a full day into this forum. I want to remind you that from the materials that describe this forum and its purpose, the overarching statement said that the goal of this conference is this, quote, to illuminate the conditions and strategies conducive to building sustainable, idea-generating environments in order to drive 21st century economic development and generate real estate value. So there again, that's really going to be the focus of this panel, bringing it down to the specifics of, call it real estate, development planning, redevelopment planning, and economic development. What we particularly hope to do is talk about what's changed in our society in recent years, and particularly with companies and the decisions they're making about where they want to be and how they want to conduct their business. Some of the things we'll talk about will be the cities that companies want to be in, the neighborhoods they're attracted to, the work environment they create inside their buildings, and very importantly, the talent they want to recruit and the ingredients that are key to attracting that talent. The panel we've put together is made up of individuals whose bios you have in the package you've received, and I think every moderator who's preceded me has said the same thing. I do, however, want to take a moment, 2 or 3 sentences on each of our panelists, because I think it's important as we start this discussion for you to have a current awareness of who's who here on our panel and from what perspective they're speaking. The first person to my right is Alexa Arena. Alexa is Vice President of Development for Forest City Enterprises, a major developer active throughout the United States, but she in particular heads up the company's San Francisco office. She's worked on a number of public-private partnership projects in San Francisco. Some of the most notable are some of the redevelopment that's taken place in the Presidio in San Francisco, the former Army base, and also a current project on Pier 70, partnering with the Port of San Francisco on what will be a major redevelopment project on the waterfront. And very relevant to this panel, she's working on the redevelopment of approximately 4 acres in what some people would call like ground zero in San Francisco right now, the South of Market area, where she and her company are in partnership with the Hearst Corporation in doing some remarkably innovative things and having some very good success, even doing so during a period of course, a significant recession in the economy. Amy Netches, to my right also, but one from your left. Amy is someone who, she and I have known each other for quite a long time. During most of that period, Amy was one of the lead individuals in the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, where she was a senior negotiator and manager, and her major projects included both Mission Bay, a significant redevelopment project on San Francisco's waterfront, just south of the financial district, and Yerba Buena district. One of those, what started out as a traditional redevelopment project 40, 50 years ago, went through many years and decades of lawsuits, but ultimately has been developed into a remarkable and quite successful multi-use project. Councilman Chris Riley is sitting to my right here. He is here from the city of Austin, where he is now in his second term on the city council, and where I have learned through our discussions, he is probably among the city council members, among his colleagues, is probably the most interested, the most passionate about issues of urban development and redevelopment, how transit fits into all of that, and how Austin can do an even better job with following up on the kind of success that it has already experienced. He served on the city's planning commission in the past and also on numerous boards and task forces. John Rosado is also on this panel. He comes to us from Austin as well, where John and his company, Southwest Strategies Group, is really intensively involved in some of the redevelopment that's going on in Austin. And in particular, he's the managing partner for a project called Sea Home. It's an 8-acre adaptive reuse project in the downtown that is planned to transform a former power plant site into a mixed-use development of office, residential, and retail. Now, that said, and I hope that gives you a little further appropriate introduction to the panel and what they'll be talking about, I'd like to show you a brief video, very brief, less than 2 minutes. Earlier this morning, Fred Dust of IDEO made reference to this. He mentioned that the organization TED granted a prize this year to City 2.0. And let me just put this on very briefly, Alina, and I'll let it speak for itself.
I am the crucible of the future. I am where humanity will either flourish or fade. I am being built and rebuilt every day. I'm inevitable, but I am not yet determined. I wish to be inclusive, innovative, healthy, soulful, thriving. But my potential can only be reached through you. You can forge a new urban outlook. Begin by connecting. Imagine a platform that brings you together, locally and globally. Combine the reach of the cloud with the power of the crowd. Connect leaders, experts, companies, organizations, and citizens. Share your tools, data, designs, successes, and ideas. Turn them into action. Together, you can bridge the gap between poor and rich communities. Spectacularly reduce your carbon footprint. Make nature part of daily life. Empower entrepreneurship. Reimagine education. Nurture health. I'm the City 2.0. Dream me, build me, make me real.
Well, let me, cover the screen, thank you. Number one, when I saw that, I thought to myself, geez, I've got to get people in my office to show me how to make videos like that to illustrate some of the points that I try to convey to people. One of the images in this video, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, I think it just gave an idea of what the potentials are for cities when people pay appropriate attention and work hard to make them all they can be. One of the images in that video, it was actually a couple of images in succession, but basically the narrator said, imagine a platform that brings you together locally and globally. Now, some may say, well, this sounds a little trite, but I think really you stop and think about that. It's what cities do and have the potential to do. Through technology, we've all been able to have so much global access But I think that it's the cities and the opportunity for people to literally come together, physically be in the presence of one another, that provides just a tremendous opportunity to be close to our customers, our collaborators, and our colleagues. And we do this in a setting that hopefully stimulates us by enhancing the quality of our work and of our social environment. So I think some of the things we heard from representatives of IDEO, what we just heard from Pixar, what some of the architects who've spoken to us have said, all of these are contributing factors to making cities even more successful, even more impactful, and putting them in a position of accommodating, innovation-based economies. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dave for a moment to complete this introduction, and then we'll start asking some questions of our panel.
All right, good morning, everyone. And can everyone hear me okay? All right, great. Well, I want to thank ULI and the Aspen Institute for having us here this morning to talk about innovative cities. Unfortunately, San Diego and Austin are both not on the list of potential most innovative cities by ULI. They've got a poll going on right now. Congratulations to San Francisco. You are on the list, so hopefully you'll make it, but maybe we'll make it next time. They might not have heard of this conference. Well, we're going to talk about Austin and San Francisco from a narrative point of view. We've got plenty of statistics. You can look those up. You can find the data, but maybe you can't find the stories. If you're talking about the data of San Francisco, you maybe wouldn't compare these two cities. We're talking about cities that are comparable in size. I believe there's about 800,000 in each, but we're talking about vastly different scales. In downtown San Francisco, you have approximately 72 million square feet of office space. In downtown Austin, you have about 8 million. You have about 8 million square feet of retail space in San Francisco. You've only got maybe 2 if you're lucky. Maybe we count a few of the food trailers. We'll put those in. But certainly in terms of pure data, you wouldn't compare the two. I will say, though, in Emerging Trends 2013 from ULI, of the top markets to invest in, first being Washington, D.C., number 2 was Austin, and number 3 was San Francisco. So somehow we've made it to the big boy club, and we're glad to be up here. But if we talk about innovation, what we're really talking about is a choice and really jobs. Jobs are going to drive our economies, they're going to drive our growth, and they're also going to drive the real estate sector. When you're talking about choice, I think you also talk about mobility. We all have a choice of where we want to live. We've heard from a lot of folks here in San Diego of why they've chosen to come to San Diego. Elliot and I, as we were preparing for this conference, talking a little bit about our backgrounds and families, realized that both of our parents had made choices to leave their hometowns of Pittsburgh and Chicago to, in Elliot's father's case, move to LA for opportunity, and in my case, to move to New Jersey. We did have the chance, I found out later, to come to La Jolla. My father chose New Jersey. I think we probably made the wrong choice, but it really wasn't in my hands at that point. But there were choices that were made. And then in talking a little bit more, Elliot and I realized that we had made choices in our own personal careers. Elliot, growing up in San Francisco, had made a choice to growing up in LA, had made a choice to go to San Francisco. And I, growing up in New Jersey, through chance, made a choice to move to Austin. And those cultures attracted us, and we've stayed there. We'll see what the next choice is for places that people go for jobs and go for community. But what we're going to touch on here is a little bit, what's the DNA or culture of your community, and how can the examples in the narrative here apply to those? Because there'll be individuals from around the state, from around the country, and from the world that'll be making choices of where they want to live and where they want to be. And hopefully we'll give you some of those tools that you can apply, some of those pieces that you can apply. Frankly, San Francisco is not Austin, Austin's not San Francisco, and all of you are unique in your communities. So you have to see kind of what fits and what works with your culture. I'm going to do just quickly a poll here to help our panelists talk to your respective areas of business. Can I get a show of hands of who's involved in real estate of the attendees? Okay, so the majority. And then in real estate, who all is involved in investment or development directly? And then in the consulting side? Okay. And then also from other industries, who's involved maybe in the nonprofit government sector? What about technology? And then the arts? Okay, great, thank you. And then another question that came up this morning by special request, we'd like to see a show of hands. First, who has an iPhone? All right. Who has a BlackBerry? And then what about an Android phone? right? Who doesn't have a phone? All right, that's what we thought. All right, so just to set a few expectations here as we get started. We're not going to have all the answers. I think we've talked about that at various times. We're searching as much as you are. I think we've heard over and over again, as much as we've been deliberate and as much as we've gained through what we've done, we've also been opportunistic and frankly lucky at times with what's come our way. I think those two matching together are really a powerful combination. The second is we really want to stimulate a conversation and also have questions from you specific to your experiences. So in so much as you have questions for these panelists, we'll leave about 20 minutes at the end to take care of those and to answer those. And we're going to be very specific on the time to make sure that we leave enough time for your questions. So I'll go ahead and hand it off to Elliot to start out. And I thank you all for being here and hosting us.
Okay. Amy, I'd like to ask you the first question. And this is something that came up in previous conversations that you and I have had. You've referred to San Francisco as having experienced a roaring innovation economy. We've talked about that in terms of the things that have happened over the last few decades in San Francisco. Now, you're in private real estate now, working for a development company that has been very active in redeveloping areas of San Francisco that have attracted a lot of these innovation-based companies. But you spent a large number of years with the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency. So among the people I know, you're one who has a real public sector. Do you need something?
I just wanted to cover that.
Oh.
Cover that.
Just cover the slide for the time being. You're someone who has very much of a public sector perspective, and what I'd like to hear from you is what you think the role of local government is and should be. Perhaps these are different things in terms of redevelopment.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. When I think about this issue, I think it's important to step back and look at the larger picture of what's happening in our economy and what's happening in our cities. I mean, innovation is not new. Innovation is as old as people have been trying to make a living and feed their families. What's changed is the technology. I mean, really referring in part to what Mary Walshak was talking about last night. I mean, there's been waves of change over time that's really been accelerated kind of in an industrial revolution context of, I guess, what you'd call the creative destruction of capitalism and markets and ideas. And different regions in different cities have been favored over time by these different technologies. I mean, Lowell, Massachusetts, in the late 1700s was the center of the industrial world for making cloth, and the reason they could do that was because they could capture the power of the rivers in New England. Then deep water ports had always been important. The spread of the railroads made Chicago an important place. Different technologies have been really more geographically focused toward what made cities rise and fall over time and what attracted entrepreneurship and innovation. In the post-industrial era that we are certainly in here in the US, the resource, instead of being river power or transportation, is really what's inside our brains. The resource is talent and intelligence and education and ideas. And that, of course, is just simply much more transportable than river power or deep water ports or other sort of more natural resource-based things. So the question becomes, why do talented, innovative people cluster in certain places and not in other places? And then further, because this is on some level a public policy issue, what can any city or region do to try to make themselves more attractive and more appealing to attract those people and develop that kind of economy? So when I look at it, it seems to me that there are really 2.5 issues in play. And the first issue is that if you look around the country and around the world, but certainly, and I've been involved in some of this work in San Francisco and working with others, it is academic and research institutions which essentially create the nexus for technology and innovation clusters. Stanford University in the Bay Area, as well as some of the other universities, clearly are what drove the development of Silicon Valley. Hewlett and Packard, in their most famous garage in the world, started, and then Intel along at the same time, really started Silicon Valley out of the research and brains and ideas that were coming out of the graduates of Stanford University. That is something, that idea of using institutions to attract entrepreneurs, to attract development. And I think in the San Diego panel yesterday afternoon, there was some talk about technology transfer and licensing, which is actually very important on a detail level. There is a lot that cities can do and do. We will talk in a little bit about what San Francisco's done to try to help the University of California in San Francisco create a biotechnology cluster. You've got examples all around the country where cities have really worked to develop and grow universities that can feed and be fed by technology clusters. Everything from the Anschutz Medical Campus out, in Colorado to Bellingham, Washington has done a great job with that. San Diego obviously has. So there's a lot that cities can do to try to help build, attract, make it possible for universities and research institutions to locate and grow within their boundaries, although obviously it's a competitive market. The second issue I think is actually a lot harder, and this is lifestyle and the types of places that young, tech-oriented, creative people want to be. And it's really, I guess it's kind of, for me, the intersection between Jane Jacobs and Richard Florida, which is that young people who are not we, I've got to tell you, looking around this room, are attracted and want to live in dense, urban, diverse, interesting places, generally with good weather and lots of outdoor recreational opportunities. People have choices, right? I mean, you don't have to go to Lowell, Massachusetts, because the only job you can get is in the textile mill, and that's where it is. People have choices, and they want a certain type of life. And it is dense urban places that are diverse and interesting and fun that people want to live in. And it's funny, we're talking about workplaces, and in some ways the workplace and the living place mimic each other, right? You've gone from private office to cubicles to, I visit a lot of tech offices, and it's basically open office space with people crowded around tables, right? And people want to live in dense urban environments that are walkable and bikeable, and there are interesting cafes and restaurants and stuff to do and stuff that they feel is their life and their work becomes almost seamless. It's hard to create that out of nothing. I mean, it really favors cities that already exist and are dense and are willing to densify further, and certainly cities that are willing to do that and create denser environments like San Francisco has, at least in parts of it, I think are able to capture that energy and grow that energy. It's really hard to turn Phoenix into that place, honestly. What can cities do? I think in some cases it's more what can cities stop doing. I mean, you can't create south of Market. You can't really create, nobody in city government in New York said, let's make Williamsburg, Brooklyn, the coolest place in the world. Williamsburg, Brooklyn became the coolest place in the world because people who are cool people went there and made it cool. And the best thing sometimes that cities can do is just get out of the way and not be stupid. And it's sort of interesting, we actually have an elected official here. My experience being in government is that government officials actually want to do things and want to make things better and want to fix things. But you have the tools you have. If all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail. Honestly, it's very easy to say, let's put in streetscape improvements and put, nice street lights on every street. I don't think this does anything. I think that it's much more organic and it's much more about the people who are there. So let me just finish, Elliot. So what's number 2.5? The other half is the network effect that people, although people like diversity, they actually also really like sameness. People want to go to places where they think people like them already are and where they feel comfortable. So if you're graduating from college as an engineering major at Purdue University, you are very likely to say, I want to go to New York, I want to go to Boston, I want to go to San Francisco, I want to go to some cool place where people who think like me and live like me already are, so that kind of the winners tend to become winners, attract more investment, attract more capital. And I think this is a particular environment economically that kind of favors certain types of places in that way.
Great, thank you. And you've alluded to some things that I will follow up with later in terms of some of the projects in San Francisco where you've seen some of these things happening, for reasons you've cited. I'd like to turn to Alexa right now to remind you she's with Forest City Enterprises in San Francisco, and I would appreciate it if you would take a moment to describe the project that you've been so very involved in for the last 4.5 years, the one in partnership with the Hearst Corporation. And let us know a little bit, too, about how you decided on the approach you took and the composition of uses that you have put together for that project.
Sure. So the 5M project is, not surprisingly, on the corner of 5th and Mission in San Francisco. It's 4 acres, and it's kind of unusual to get 4 acres in downtown San Francisco. It's actually not in Soma. Its character now feels a lot like Soma, so that was somewhat intentional. But it's at the juncture of really different neighborhoods, right next to 6th Street, which is an affordable housing corridor that has a really intense amount of poverty and diversity to it. Mid-Market, which is much more the emerging arts district, Yerba Bueno, that's our formal arts district, and Soma and downtown. So when we went to go speak to the city of what is the future of 5M and met with the head of the mayor's office of economic development and the planning director, really quickly they said something that we completely agreed, which is we think that we're off a little bit in the types of downtowns that we're creating, and we think this site offers an opportunity to attract the companies or to keep them in San Francisco as they grow, so the Googles and so forth who get big enough and they move out to Silicon Valley. So that was our challenge at hand. And clearly for developers, we typically look at what's been done and kind of can look at market data from a past-looking perspective, but we needed a new tool for the forward-looking perspective. And that's where a lot of IDEO's work, actually, their process came into play. And we said, what if you apply that process as the developer and really become much more inquisitive on not necessarily think of yourself as a product developer. So don't think of yourself as a physical designer that's thinking just about skyline and formation and building forms that have worked in the past, but try to understand the innovation process, the process in which people gather and form community and build around that. And what I think is really illuminating when you do that is you really quickly learn that you're not using the right tools or not focusing on the right tools, at least from a process perspective. So we go right to architecture often. We go right to form very often. And what we learned was we should be really thinking about who are your occupiers, who are the people that are driving your culture that you want on that site to create what we can, in simple developer terms, think of as the Bloomingdale's to a retail center. Who's your series of cultural anchors to what is an innovation center? And so the economy then crashed. So we had 200,000 square feet of vacant space and a little more time on our hands, which was really a blessing in disguise because it gave us time to prototype and to look at the different categories of who those occupiers are to kind of respond to this work process of innovation being very social, wanting people saying, look, the financial district for me, I hate the elevator. Why do you hate the elevator? And breaking that down, it was the experience of kind of shuffling in and out from 7 to 9, looking next to you. The guy's wearing the same suit. He looks exactly like you. There's a Starbucks in the base. You could be in any city. This was not fodder for inspiration for people going into their campuses or their places like Pixar and having to be extremely creative. So they weren't moving to those areas. Actually, the users were way ahead of us. So Pixar and Google and so forth were creating campuses that had the amenities that were almost like cities and creating what those social interactions are, acknowledging that the office is both a place of social exchange and of work, and those two actually are blended now. The only thing that we heard as feedback when we went and did user research was the reason I go on the Google bus every day is, frankly, I don't ask dumb questions in my campus environment. I ask them of my friends in different industries. I see transparency. I have more diverse networks in the city. And so it's worth it to me to be in the city. One person actually had this great quote where they said, my company didn't hire me, they hired my network. And there was this deep understanding that unless I have transparency to other worlds, I'm not going to come up with great ideas. And cities give people that. And so there was this clear task at hand of how do you build that ground up? What does that mean for the way that we think of development and reorient to the central financial district type of model to what we call the central social district? And we realized that much like the TED Prize for the first time didn't go to a person, it went to an idea, a city, which is the creation of many different people, that our job was to cultivate those networks and give them what we had, which was space and operational capacity to do their thing. So we curated them in a variety of different categories, which is, I think, on the next slide. Go one more slide. There we go. And these categories, as much as we try to create the toolbox, it's going to be different in every city. Certainly the people you curate in each of them are very city specific. But they are around things that innovators and creators and community members said helped them gather. So arts, which is a very universal language. We've talked a lot about language between diverse networks, and you have to have that set of inspiration that art gives you and a universality that art can give you from a language perspective. So we surveyed in each of these categories at least a dozen different people to try to understand what their models were and see if they were network builders themselves. And we ended up with Intersection for the Arts, who's been in San Francisco for 60 years. Their home was the mission, but the vision drove them to say, how can we make arts the forefront of economic development and growth? How can arts not just be an expression, but a process and a tool? So there are sort of arts anchor. The hub, which again, we did the same thing around entrepreneurship and co-working. We picked a social change focused co-working model. But really what that was about was shared vision. The more people have shared vision, the more they share. The more they share, the more they create community and self-generate community. So the hub has this, incredible space that's blown up. It's expanded to twice the size because it was bursting at the seams. Every night they clear out the tables, they have events. Those events are run by their members. So they're almost acting like a retailer in developer world in terms of the volume of creatives that come in and out and the volume of events and things that go on there. Tech Shop, which is a gym membership model for every tool you can imagine to make or prototype, launched tons of companies. Won't go too deeply into anything, but then we didn't have a sort of a kitchen model, so we ended up with off the grid. And again, and then Square as our sort of technology anchor, which at the time I interviewed Jack Dorsey as part of the user research. And frankly, he just was like, this is really interesting. I'm going to go in there with my new company. This was no intelligence on my part. It was just aligned vision. He was 3 people, and now it's obviously exploded as a company. And all these things helped us learn how to design a better campus, how to operate it, and how to build those partnerships. And I can give many examples of that, but I'm cognizant of time.
Great. Thanks, Alexa. I think we're going to move now to a little bit on the DNA and the culture. I'll just use a food example. If I'm going to look for some good dim sum, I'm probably going to go to San Francisco. I'm not going to find that in Austin. If I want to get a great breakfast taco, Austin's the place to go, certainly not San Francisco. So, Chris, can we talk a little bit about Austin's specific identity beyond food, and then how the city used policy and practice maybe to encourage that and enhance it?
Sure. Well, first off, I want to agree with Amy that it really isn't up to the city to define the identity for the city through policy. And that did happen in their earliest days when Austin was identified as the location for the Capitol and later as the location for the University of Texas. But in more recent years, the impacts on our identity have been much less direct. So really, if you go up to
Can you all hear that?
okay, I'll try to hold it a little closer. They most Austinites, if you ask most Austinites about the identity of the city, chances are you're going to hear something about music, because for many years Austin has been known as a center for music, and I guess it really started getting stronger back around the late 60s, early 70s with Willie Nelson and a bunch of others. Really, the role of the city came along, at some point the city came along and attached a label to it by branding the city, branding Austin as the live music capital of the world. So if you visit the airport in Austin, you'll see that slogan loud and clear. You'll hear local music on playing at the airport. We've done our best to embrace that strength, which had grown organically. It did not start with the city. In fact, it's a lot of its strength in recent years has been through the South by Southwest Music Festival, which was started by our local alternative weekly, the Austin Chronicle. Not even the establishment newspaper could get that going. It was the alternative. In recent years, that has expanded with a tech multimedia component, which has wound up supporting the tech industry. Now the city has worked a lot at trying to identify the city as a center for high tech, and that has had real impacts. But it has really been through trying to work with the university and the private sectors to foster an environment for tech incubation. But a lot of the impacts, frankly, have been fairly indirect, and the emphasis on music has actually wound up helping by expanding through the South by Southwest Festival and other things, in making Austin a place where the young folks, the young creative class, really wants to be. The other thing you'll hear if you ask people about the identity of the city is they like its weirdness. The big slogan that has emerged in the last 10 or 20 years is "Keep Austin Weird," and people take that very seriously in Austin. You'll see, I can't tell you how often you'll see that on bumper stickers and T-shirts from all kinds of Austinites. People love the idea of keeping Austin weird, and obviously that is not something that could come from the city. That would not be a very effective thing for the city to foist on the citizenry. But it actually has turned out to strengthen our interest in promoting a tech capital, because it works to help make Austin more of a quirky, interesting, different sort of place with personality, the kind of place that draws that creative class that can bring continual innovation and energy to the tech sector and to the city in general. So it's really been a matter of identifying the city's strengths and trying to reinforce them through however we can. But we have to recognize the limitations on the city's role. Really, the genesis of the city's identity comes organically through the people that we attract there.
Great. Thanks, Chris. John, let's talk a little bit similar to Alexa about a specific project. Let's talk about See Home, and Alina, if you can take the cover off. Tell us a little bit about See Home, your project, as well as a little bit about the role of the private and the public partnership that you all have there. And what I'll show on here very quickly is you can see here downtown Austin. The capital is a little bit further to the north here. You've got Lady Bird Lake here, which is the dam lower Colorado River. And right here to the west of town, along the spine of 2nd Street, which has been redeveloped, and Chris may talk about that a little bit later, you have the old power plant, the See Home power plant. So this is the project that John and his partners are working on, and I'll go to the next one and we'll see a rendering. And this is looking from east over here to west back towards downtown. So I'll hand it over to you, John.
Thank you. First, See Home, relative to what we're talking about here, is a relatively small project. And one of the things that I'll say about the See Home project itself is it was very, very important for the city's role. The city about 12 or 13 years ago embarked on figuring out what to do with about 12 city blocks that were owned and controlled by the city that were along the Lady Bird Lake. See Home was a power plant on the west end of that spine, and they really encouraged through incentives and also through design guidelines how 2nd Street and how those city-owned blocks would get developed, and then put them in private developers' hands with a certain set of performance criteria. The power plant was a little bit different. It was owned by Austin Energy, and Austin Energy quit generating electricity there in 1992, and for a long time it was sitting there because nobody knew what to do with it. And at one point, Austin Energy said, well, let's just knock it down. We have 7 acres of ground here that would be incredibly valuable on the lakefront. And at that point, the Keep Austin Weird sentiments came out, and the citizens came up and said, no, you're not going to knock down the power plant. It's too iconic, it's too unusual, it's too important to the history of the city. It was built in 1952. has some strong Art Deco kind of industrial feel to it. And so in 2004, the city put out an RFP for private developers to become a partner with the city in the rebirth of the power plant. And through a very long process, only because it was cutting new territory in terms of coming up with a master development agreement where the city and the private developer have certain responsibilities to each other in order to redevelop the site. So the city's role in this was extremely important, and it wouldn't have happened without it.
And I think that speaks a little bit to what Tom mentioned yesterday about the intersection of the private and the public sector, where the gain on the private side matches the value on the public side. And certainly that's worked out well, and that relationship has helped you, I think, weather some of the difficulties that, Alexa, you mentioned as a blessing in disguise, which really disguised, I would guess, given the severity of the economic downturn. How are we doing on time, Elliot?
We're doing just fine.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me ask for the mic. Thank you. I'd like to go back to Amy because you set the stage in such a way that I'd like you now, Amy, to talk about a couple of the projects that you're most familiar with in San Francisco, Mission Bay being one, and Yerba Buena Center District another one, in terms of how some of those ingredients you were talking about as being critical, how they came together in those two places.
Yeah. Hey, Alina, take off the phone. Technology.
I get that in the eye.
This is great. So I have like 4 slides on the Mission Bay district. So, and because it's a great example of not only using resources in a public-private way to attract institutions, but it's really about the change of technology and the change of land use in response to that in an economic way over time. Can I just have that thing? Sure. Is it this thing? So Mission Bay is an area in the city that was, literally a bay, as you can see. It was part of the shipbuilding industry in San Francisco back when that was what we were doing in San Francisco. San Francisco, that area that you're looking at now, let me see if I can make this thing work. Yeah, that big one. So this is Mission Bay. It got filled in by the railroad companies, and it became a rail yard for the San Francisco port, which was the busiest port on the West Coast for 100 years, until essentially World War II. So this was an incredibly important part of the economy of San Francisco, which was at that time a truly industrial city. So post-World War II, shipping becomes containerized. San Francisco doesn't do that. The container port moves to Oakland. This becomes completely obsolete and blighted. So you can see downtown in the background. So you've got 300 acres of flat land on the bay doing nothing in San Francisco, which is insane, right? So after many, many years of planning, the city and Catalyze Development Corporation, which owned the property, the spin-off of the railroad companies, finally came up with a plan that, working with the University of California at San Francisco, UCSF, created a 43-acre campus for UCSF to build a research campus. Now, it so happens they're also, at this point, this is a slightly old slide, building a hospital, but the main goal was to have them build about 2.5 million square feet of research space. City and Catalyze gave them the land for free and built and paid for the infrastructure, but they were responsible, state was responsible for building all of the buildings, and this is sort of the central core of the buildings that this is a 2-year-old photo, were underway. And then all this area around here was designated, this is privately owned property that at that time was owned by Catalyze, was designated as space for private development, for private biotech and tech companies, for office space and lab space that would basically work with the scientists at UCSF, which has a very, very good technology transfer system for royalties and everything, and to attempt to essentially bring a biotech industry into San Francisco, and it's actually been quite successful. It's a long-term project. Biotech funding, venture funding is slow and lumpy, but there is, at this point, in addition to the campus, about 1.5 million square feet of private space have been built, have been occupied by not only a large number of biotech companies, but also office space by tech companies, including actually the Gap has space down there, though they're not very techy. Interestingly, I would note that this area over here is the property that Salesforce bought and was about to start a giant campus, which we were very excited about, but they changed their mind. So that property is back on the market if anyone needs a 2 million square foot campus. Part of the plan, though, I have to tell you, is up here, and you can see the beginning of it here, is that this area, a little further north of the campus, is a new residential, a high-density residential community. Again, this is a slightly old slide. It's about half built out. There's about 3,000 new units, all occupied, a mix of rentals and condominiums, market rate and below market. When it's all built out, there should be about 11,000, 12,000 people living there. There's also a site for a school. There's a new police station being built. There are parks. It's a whole new community. It is not going to be a cool place like South of Market or the Castro or the Haight or Williamsburg, Brooklyn, but it will be a dense, functional new part of the city, and most importantly, it's brought a whole new industry and a whole new part of our economy into San Francisco.
Thank you, Amy. I know I mentioned Yerba Buena also, but in the interest of time, I think we'll save that for next year's conference or something like that. I'd like to ask one more question. Dave is going to do the same with the remaining panelists, and then we'll open it up for hopefully about 20 minutes of questions from the audience, from all of you. There's something I saw in the New York Times this summer. A front page article had the title, "New San Francisco Tech Boom Brings Jobs but Also Worries." So, you know, a discussion like this should, of course, look at all sides of an issue, not just the success stories that we've been able to share with you so far. And, you know, largely what has happened in San Francisco in the last few decades has been pretty darn successful, you know, notwithstanding a few recessions occurring during that same period of time. But what this article pointed out was a few of the side effects that have come along with this growth and this success. It talked about how high housing prices, both for sale and rental. It talked about very high commercial rents. We have among the highest anywhere. It talked about fewer families being able to live in San Francisco. And this is not a new phenomenon, but a lot of young couples, they get married, they have children, they end up moving out of the city to either find more affordable housing and or public schools that are satisfactory by their definition. San Francisco does suffer from a reputation of having a very poor public school district. And the other characteristic it talked about was maybe less diversity in the city, resulting from the city growing and expanding in a way that seems really cool to, say, the technology sector, the social media and the like. But the issue was raised, are we leaving behind some groups in San Francisco who are really, and who have historically contributed to what has made San Francisco so great, and have contributed to the diversity that a lot of these companies are attracted to right now. So maybe I'll ask, this is a question anyone on the panel can address, maybe if I could start with you, Alexa, in light of what you're doing, whether you have thoughts on that article and the issues it raised.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's concerning. It's going to be San Francisco's greatest challenge. So I think when you're really successful, this becomes an increasing challenge for obvious reasons. There's price pressure, and price pressure changes the demographic of who can and can't participate in the city. And so then the question becomes, how do you create, and then we've looked at this a lot in 5M, I can't answer the whole policy question of families and so forth, but how we look at an ecosystem around innovation is that you need diversity. If you don't have diversity, you actually end up with a suburban office park, which is, by the way, not a bad thing. It's just not playing off the value of the city. So we've designed effectively partnerships to try to help facilitate and give the civic realm back to much more diverse programming. And that is through Intersection for the Arts, who's very much designing program around how arts is a bridge building tool, working with Policy Link, which is Angela Blackwell and a group that did, or at least helped form Harlem Children's Zone and some pretty comprehensive models like that. And what they're attempting to do is say, what is the ways in which people who, as an example, are children on 6th Street can bridge their way into the creative economy? And secondly, how do you use placemaking as a tool, whether that's art on the side of walls or events like the Urban Prototyping Festival that's happening at 5M, where thousands of people are coming to, et cetera, where people are participating from really diverse sectors and kind of occupying the space. They own the space. That is their civic realm. And when you do that, you create much more diverse areas, much more sustainable areas. I think there's another question around regionalism here of like, how do you also connect to various regions, particularly on the issue related to housing and middle income housing. So we haven't cracked that nut, but we have cracked it more and are kind of in the process of working on it from a participatory standpoint and from new models for workforce training for the creative economy.
Thank you.
Can I take a crack at that? I mean, these are very real issues, and I think that Alexa's hit on, it's an important part of it, which is that people in the creative economy want to live and work in a diverse, interesting place with all kinds of people, but they can be so successful that they squeeze those people out. And obviously, from a public policy point of view, they're much more pressing issues around affordability and affordable housing and making sure you have a diverse enough economy so that every time there's a tech bust, you know, the entire city doesn't drop so much. But at least what happens in San Francisco is that it's hard to have quality public discourse on these issues. It becomes so polarized and so black and white. San Francisco is a place that people love, and they tend to love it exactly the way it was the day they arrived. So, you know, you've got, you know, people who are essentially aging hippies who showed up in the late 60s and want the city to be exactly like that. And you've got people who showed up in the tech boom of the 1990s who are angry at the new tech people for showing up. I mean, it's almost absurd sometimes to the extent to which people kind of want to do a gates closed thing. We do have very robust affordable housing requirements and requirements that new office development contribute to that. But there's also the other side where you've got people who want to restrict development, you know, restrict economic uses in parts of the city to essentially obsolete industries that don't even exist. So I think it's really important for people like Alexa, who are in the private sector, and I guess I am too now, to try to participate in the dialogue in a nuanced and creative way that acknowledges the problems and tries to deal with them in a good way.
Just a quick follow-up comment on that. There was another thing that Fred said this morning around partnerships, and I guess what I would say is intersection and kind of partnering with nonprofits and bridging between those two worlds, which requires a tremendous amount of trust and a clarity around that interdependency and why it works for both people is pretty critical in this. Because even if the developer's not going to have the successful dialogue, it's the proof of those things happening and those partnerships happening and the kind of the larger cultivation of partners that you create around a vision that makes it happen. So I just wanted to kind of clarify on part of that.
And I'll just say I'm amazed at the similarities I hear between San Francisco and Austin, because the same things that Amy said about San Francisco, you could say about Austin. It is a huge issue in Austin. We've seen a lot of success. Even we weathered the recession pretty well. But we saw it continually increasing property values and therefore increasing tax burden. Austin actually has the lowest property tax rate of any major city in Texas, but because our land values are higher than other cities in Texas, we wind up with the largest property tax burden, and it keeps growing along with the growth. And you see the same wedge that driven between the old folks and the newcomers that Amy described in San Francisco. So in response to that, we're trying a number of things. And 6 years ago, when we had our last major bond election, we actually had a $55 million item to support affordable housing through the issuance of bonds. We're going to have another one this coming fall, in which the number for affordable housing is going up to about 76 million. It's a little unusual to actually be issuing bonds to support affordable housing on that scale, but absolutely. In fact, the public has demanded those bonds more so than almost to the point, almost as much as they want transportation improvements. They're demanding a lot of affordable housing. My hope is that as we continue to see growth, that we will find new ways of providing diverse housing options, and we can find ways of achieving infill on our corridors, for instance, and providing housing options that wind up being more affordable simply by virtue of being more diverse and smaller lots, smaller units, more so than we've seen in the past. And so I'm hopeful that we will have success at accommodating growth without squeezing out the old timers, but it is a continual challenge.
Go right ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say this in an affordable housing section, but I think it's really important to say one of the other challenges in Austin is if you try to do affordable housing downtown high-rise, it's very, very difficult. And the city does have standards for a certain percentage of affordable units even within high-rises, but that I'm sure is a challenge to all cities.
I want to mention one more thing related to this, and then I think we should go to the audience for comments. There's something that those of you who don't live in California may not be aware of, and that is that California had the benefit of a redevelopment law that was passed by the legislature roughly 50 years ago that enabled cities and other jurisdictions, counties as well, to create redevelopment agencies. And it gave those agencies some tremendous tools to assemble land, to issue debt that had the label of tax increment financing. And that tax increment financing enabled the cities to build new streets, put in utilities, do other things of an infrastructure nature that enabled projects, for example, like the Mission Bay one that you saw Amy present, enabled them to happen. Without that, very hard to say that such a large area could have been redeveloped as extensively as it was. But what's important is that as of February of this year, redevelopment is gone in California as we knew it. There are some successor entities that are in place in cities to try and deal with the projects that were in progress, but our cities have lost some of these tools which made them key public-private partnership participants. And there's just a whole lot of conversation now going on in the state, certainly in the offices of every one of those cities that was using redevelopment, but also among organizations like ours, like ULI, trying to address what would we like to see in the next 3 to 5 years that hopefully could replace some of those tools. We know we're not going to see redevelopment agencies again as we knew them, but we do think that because redevelopment played such a key economic development role in the state, that something has to happen, and we'd like to have some input into what does happen.
Just in addition to that, C-Home would not happen without tax increment financing. That's what is
Your project.
supported it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, with that, as before, there should be some microphones in the audience, and we welcome your questions. I think we have about 20 minutes, unless someone corrects me, given when we started. But 20 just turned into 15.
15, great. I'm Alan Asagira, visiting from London, and I have a colorful story for the panel here. About 5 years ago, I moved from San Francisco, 20 years there. Spent a lot of time in high tech, including Apple and on the board of Burning Man in your 5M project. So, nice space. My concern here is I've been trying to build bridges between San Francisco and London as an outpost to Europe. And the other day, flew in, very jet lagged, woke up, went for a run, and it was like Dawn of the Dead out there. It was absolutely the most frightening thing I've ever seen. And to be going out there and meeting with some of the richest people in the world, with some of the most innovative companies, what can we do to address this increasing digital divide?
Are you talking about homelessness? What are you talking about?
It was actually, no, it was, if you go out the door from the St. Regis and you make a right, going for a run down to the waterfront was just, homeless people everywhere.
Yeah, on Mission Street.
Yeah.
You're raising a serious urban problem, which is we have a really significant homelessness problem in San Francisco and I think in some other cities. San Francisco is got a nice climate. It's got very liberal social policies. It is a place that has a lot of emotional struggles about how to deal with the issue of homelessness and social behavior. The city puts enormous amounts of money and effort into outreach programs and to programs to try to bring people into supportive housing, into drug treatment, in all the social services There is a great reluctance to embrace more compulsive types of programming and more police action. This is a problem that has plagued cities for a long time. Frankly, it goes back to the 1980s and the deinstitutionalization of mental health care in this country in the Reagan administration. It is a problem that San Francisco struggles with, but I think it is a problem that is a national problem. And I wish that we had good answers. It's a very, very, very hard issue for all of us.
Yeah, it also leads to, San Francisco is extraordinarily progressive, obviously, for those of you who didn't know. And that, I think, gives it a certain culture of that, the ability to fail, the openness, and so forth, and it has its downsides, too. So they're two ends of the same coin. So I don't think it's a surprise that you're meeting with people who are sort of some of the wealthiest individuals who run phenomenal companies, and they're in a very progressive city that probably does have very good social policy, which is making it a center point for people who are homeless to say it's better to be in this city with this cultural environment. And so it's a tough problem to quote unquote fix, because you could do the sort of Giuliani days, which I lived in New York at the time, of like clear it out. But what is your culture shifting to when you do that? So anyway, and I constantly had this conversation even with people within Forest City that are like, San Francisco is crazy. You always get lawsuits and entitlements. And I'm like, yes, but it's also what makes it probably the most successful market in the country right now. So.
Hi, this is Mary from ULI. I had a question for the Austin contingency. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about if the culture that you created there was intentional or if it evolved organically over time.
Well, I'd like to say it was intentional, but I have to say that most of what you see in Austin truly is organic for many of the same reasons that I outlined before. That the weirdness and the music and really the natural environment that we have here, all the things that draw people to Austin, really that has very little to do with city policy. We've done the best we can to protect the assets that we have, to protect the environment that we have there, to build upon the strengths that we have. And to work with the private sector to ensure that we have the right environment to support continued strength in all of our economic sectors. But I can't really claim credit for the basic identity. The things that make Austin so popular don't really have so much to do with direct government policy beyond just our protecting what's there. Really, the things that make Austin cool really came from the people of Austin.
I think the music industry is a main draw for Austin. Outside the South by Southwest Festival, also Austin City Limits, which has a national following. I think it's the longest music show in history. And you can go to Europe and talk about Austin, and they'll ask about Austin City Limits or the South by Southwest Music Festival. Obviously, having the university, very large university there, has helped promote the creative class.
And I will say we've done our best to embrace those strengths and to build upon them. We just recently extended the Austin City Limits Music Festival to 2 weekends. We waive all kinds of fees for both that and South by Southwest. We partner with them. We're very active in supporting them, but really they didn't start with the city. They started outside the city.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, but I'll just add from my experience over the last 16 years that I've lived in Austin. I think Austin also knows what it's not. I mean, we're fully cognizant that we're within kind of the same economic zone as Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston. We're never going to be as large as those cities. We're not going to be those cities. Austin's made, I think, a very specific point from policy, I'll say, not to look for a pro sports franchise. I mean, that came up last night. You may argue we've got a semi-pro team in town with the University of Texas, but we haven't spent money on a stadium. We haven't actively pursued that. We've got a very active population athletically. But I think the city and the population has made a specific decision to say what we're not as well, and let's not try to reach for those things that kind of are beyond our culture and our DNA.
Hi, Norm Miller, San Diego. Amy brought up a developer's dream, free land with infrastructure. I'm sure there's lots of strings attached. I'm sure that Forest City's good at pulling those strings as well in different cities and doing JVs. Could you expand upon how that works, that partnership between the city and the developer? Let's say that the development is more successful or less successful than expected. What are the strings?
Okay.
What are the sharing arrangements, if you can give us a
Let me talk
snapshot?
about the specifics and then the general. Mission Bay was owned by a private developer, Catalyze Development Corporation. The University of California at San Francisco, which wanted to expand from its existing campus, where it was very hemmed in by residential neighborhoods, did a very successful job of looking at 3 or 4 different cities around the Bay and saying, we're going to go to one of these, who's going to give us the best deal? And the city, we had great political leadership and institutional leadership, worked with Catalyze to convince Catalyze, with the city's contribution, to give free land. The city gave 13 acres, Catalyze gave 30 acres to UCSF to build this campus so that we could create a biotech zone. So to be clear, we were not giving free land to a private developer, we were giving it to a University of California campus. And those guys are pretty smart, and it was pretty clear if the only number that was going to keep them on this in San Francisco was 0. So that was a very specific case where we were giving land to a state institution. We do not give land, cities don't give land to developers. There are all kinds of ways to format public-private partnerships where cities do sell land, sometimes for ground rent plus a percentage, sometimes for a base plus an upside. In the case of Mission Bay, since we didn't own the surrounding land, the city doesn't have a participation, and in fact, all of the tax increment from Mission Bay is used to pay for the infrastructure and pay for the affordable housing and pay for the parks. But there are lots of ways for cities to capture a fair share of the upside. I happen to be involved in the Public-Private Partnership Council at ULI, and we spend a lot of time talking about these structures. I thought Tom Murphy was very passionate last night talking about cities, the need for cities to be foresighted and invest. You have to invest, but you have to be smart and not get taken to the cleaners, which can be hard, but you basically got cities taking risks that maybe the private sector on its own simply is not going to be able to take.
So really quickly, the 5M project is not a public-private partnership, and it doesn't get any subsidy from the city. What its economic model is that if you create great culture, people pay a premium. And actually, that's happened with Square. They had a 5-year lease, paid $50 a square foot, which was $5 over where other tenants were, put TIs in there that I reminded them about 12 times that in... We are seeking an upzoning. That is, in fact, the case. So there is that mechanism in which we can say the civic realm can go to some of that upzoning. But the economic model is based on office premium. And those office premium rents have happened for us. So just something to think about, that there's a private model in there.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, hi, my name is Lou Wells from Living City Block. A question for you, Alexia. You might have just answered it, but to reiterate, in your tenanting strategy, which was really quite interesting, did you have to subsidize some of your market rent rates to get some of those particular sought-after creative types into the space? And was there a public sector role in that strategy?
So there wasn't in the first phase. We did not subsidize them compared to where the market was, but we had Class C buildings. So when we do the development, we'll keep one of the buildings at the historic building, so we can offer more affordable rents. We probably will have some type of give back to the center civic space, which we want to do anyway. And then we'll do the new construction. So there'll be sort of the permanency of that more affordable office. Again, goes back to the really simple example of the retail model where, when you do a retail center, often with your anchor retail tenant like the Bloomingdale's, you don't really charge them rent because you're gaining more rent from everyone else around them that needs to be around them. So similar type of kind of subsidy model.
And I would just reiterate also 2 different models here where you've got land in one case, which is quote-unquote greenfield, and Seaholm as well, and then also a district similar to Idea District here in San Diego, and a little bit what happens in downtown Austin in the Soma District, which different models kind of playing off the same, but certainly not exactly. I want to say we're finished here. Thank the panelists for joining us, and thank Elliot.
Wanted to let you know, little round of applause. And then to let everyone know, we're going directly into a working session for lunch. I believe we've got a buffet-style lunch similar to breakfast. If you'll get lunch and come right back in, we'll get started in about 15 minutes. Thank you.